Hello everybody, welcome to another GrantTree Fundamentals. This week an update on the advice process. It seemed like a good time to do that. It's a while since we've looked at it and it is very important to us. So, the thing about GrantTree is it's a business where everybody has power, right? We all have as much power as we want or need. So we can, like Ming, who is all powerful, say I can do anything. By which we also mean I can fulfill my potential, which let's not forget is our purpose. And if you want to know how it is that we can do anything, how it is that we can fulfill our potential here, we can do it using the advice process. The advice process is the source of all our power, right? It's where we derive our ability to do stuff. In fact, here's a diagram that explains that, right? The advice process is how we make decisions, and from decisions we get our power. And then obviously the correlate of power is responsibility, because responsibility is linked to action. So the advice process is about saying that people can take decisions, make decisions and take actions, which gives you power and responsibility. And that basically, in a nutshell, is what self-management is. And that's why I think of the advice process as the first law of self-management, or if you'd rather be Fight Club about it, it's the first rule of self-management. And the first rule of self-management is anybody can make any decision if they have all the advice they need to make a good decision for the business. This includes asking those impacted or with expertise. It's not as punchy as just saying the first rule is don't talk about Fight Club. And I have modified it slightly since the version earlier in the year. So that it now says if you have all the advice that you need to make a good decision for the business. I think that was kind of implicit in the way that we were saying it before, but I thought it was important to rephrase that. That's obviously out there for people's advice and input. If you want to compare it to the other one or grab me and talk about that. We've talked quite a bit about when the advice process applies. Right, the simple answer is the advice process always applies. And I think the first reason for that is because the advice process is how we as human beings make decisions. It's how we navigate through the world. You know, we say, okay, here's the thing that I need to do. How might I go about it? We think about it, we do some research, we ask some people, we mull that all over, and then we make what we think is the best decision. If you remember also last week when we were talking about feedback, I said that open culture is both how we are with each other and how we do the work. And that's one view of open culture. Another view of open culture, and it's just kind of restating and reframing the same stuff, is that open culture is kind of two things, right? It's the advice process and it's the workflow. And the stuff that comes under the advice process is communication, because it's how we give feedback, it's how we ask for and give advice. And it's the kind of special uses of the advice process. That's another sort of separate part of the culture. These are basically the structures of the culture, right? So the special uses of the advice process are things like how do you choose what to work on, or what do you do if things aren't going well, right? So this is basically everything that we presented in GrantTree Fundamentals this year has been about the advice process, the things we need to make it work, the special uses, and that's really like a core plank of what open culture is. And I don't know if we've kind of made that clear, so I thought it'd be worth restating. And this is another reason, right, why the advice process always applies, because it's just fundamental to open culture and how we work. So I think it's important to stop and think about that for a second. You know, what we're saying is that our culture is built on a process which says that anybody can do anything. Right? That's essentially what that rule is. Anybody can make any decision. Right? But I think it's easy to get caught up in an idea that maybe the culture is somehow something that's in the way of us doing things, that's stopping us. I think there's a contradiction there between a culture built on a principle that says anybody can do anything and the belief that the culture gets in the way. So if you do find people thinking, oh, the culture gets in the way, I'm really interested to talk to you about that and understand where that comes from and what the obstacles are and what we need to do to make that work. And actually, you know, and yet another reason why the advice process always applies. You know, how different is the advice process from the way that decisions are made in other businesses? Right, for me, in a really well-run, top-down kind of traditional business, people who have the power to take decisions, you know, and you have more power and you're able to take more decisions the higher up the tree you get. When they're making a decision, they go out, they seek advice, they respond to objections, they explain their reasoning, they get buy-in. You know, good CEOs of companies, good CEOs, good, you know, like directors of sales or whatever, are not going to say to their team, you know, this is how it's going to be and you're just going to do it because I'm going to tell you. Because that's not going to produce people actually, you know, genuinely, enthusiastically and in a motivated way doing what you want them to do. For me, the only real difference between a self-managing business and a top-down business in this context is that in a self-managing business, people aren't limited about the decisions that they can make by their position. They're only limited by the decisions that they're willing to make and the decisions that they take on. And also, actually, we have this extra strength because in a top-down business where you have the right of power, where you have this kind of violent right to coerce people and say, you're going to do this because I'm telling you and there's no comeback, because if you don't do it, I'm going to fire you. You don't have to do this. You don't have to go through this process of good decision making. You can bypass it and just say, because I'm the boss. Whereas we can't. We always have to follow this process. So we're always following the process, for me, that is best practice decision making. Now, the thing about going out and seeking advice is, and we've all experienced this, is that sometimes you get advice that's contradictory. Right? Sometimes you get advice from two different people that contradicts each other, or sometimes the advice that you get back from other people contradicts your own view of how things should be done. So how do you handle that? There are three concepts that I'd like to introduce here. Some of these will be familiar to some of you. Some of them will be new to some of you. Some of you will say, well, this is bread and butter for me, but I think it's worth going through them. So the first is this concept of the third story. Yeah, no. Oh, we've got an animation. Let's have an animation. Yeah, it's kind of easy to think of making a decision a little bit like this, right? There are loads of different answers out there, and one of them is right, and you have to go and find the right answer. But life is actually very rarely like this. There's very rarely one perfect right answer. Things are much more like this. There's a spectrum of answers, some of which are more useful and some of which are less useful. Now, how do we make sure we get a good or useful answer, right? Something more towards this end. Well, we do it by following the advice process, right? By seeking advice. But what happens if you have a decision that you're going to make and you see the decision as being here, and somebody else sees it as more being there, right? How do we deal with that? We assume that if we want a reason, if we want a theory Y or a theory Y, that people don't make bad decisions deliberately. Just like people aren't a dick deliberately. For me, the classic example of this, the thing that really winds me up is if I'm on a dance floor, and I've got my little boogie, I've got my space, I'm really happy, and I'm having a good time, and then somebody's coming through to their friends with their drinks, and they're just like, they're just steamrolling through my space. You sort of think, well, they're not trying to be a dick, they're just caught up in their own world. Right? They're just like, oh, I've really got to get to my friends, it's really important to me, so they're going to do that. Or if you're cycling along and a pedestrian steps out in front of you without really looking, and you think, this is ridiculous. I would never do that. And then, 2 weeks later, you're walking along and you step out in front of a cyclist. We're just caught up, right? We don't deliberately do things badly, but we have a limited perspective on the world, and with that information that we have, we act in good faith to do the best thing that we can. So this is where the third story is kind of useful, right? We might think that, if we disagree about whether a decision is the right one or the wrong one, that it's to do with the fact that, there's some stuff that we both see, and then there's also maybe some facts that you have that I don't have, and some facts that I have that you don't have. But actually, the reality can be closer to this, right? That there's no overlap between what you see and I see. And the reason for this is because everything that you see is filtered through you, and everything that I see is filtered through me. So even though we're looking at the same stuff, we're going to be seeing it differently. So that stuff in the overlap there, I'm going to see through my filter. So it's going to appear different to me than it does to you. A great analogy here is the analogy of the beach ball. We can all be standing on the same beach ball. But if I'm standing here, and you say, oh, tell me about the beach ball, and I say, well, if it's blue, it's just completely blue as far as the eye can see. But maybe over the horizon it's a bit of yellow and pink. But what if you're standing here, We're going to be describing the same situation, but because of our perspectives, because of our viewpoints, we're going to report things very differently, even though we're looking at the same stuff. So this, for me, is where the concept of the third story is useful. Right? I have my story, the stuff that I see, my version of reality, which is completely subjective, but which I believe is absolutely true, because that's the human condition, right? That's something we can't escape. You have your story, but then there's also this third story, which encompasses us both as human beings, in the universe, looking at stuff, building a subjective reality. So when we disagree, this is a great place to come to say, can we find the third story, right? Can we find a reality that there's some stuff that we're looking at and perceiving differently? The very worst outcome for me, if you can find the third story, is that we agree to differ. We say, oh, well, that's, we've just got our own perspectives and that's how it's going to be. We can't reconcile that. And for me, this is if you can find a third story through curiosity, it's a very non-violent approach. It's a great way to manage conflict. The best outcome is actually that we find that there's at least 2% truth in the other person's story. You know, that there's something there that we can take into our version of reality and we can modify our story. And you know, this to me is where the advice process is strong, because different points of view are actually the, you know, like this is the meta Popeye, right? If the spinach of GrantTree is the advice process, then the spinach of the advice process is differing points of view. But when you're dealing with differing points of view, right, this is the next concept I wanted to come to, something important is being heard, right? If you remember when we did, either you were there or you watched the video, the introduction to the advice process at the very start of the GrantTree Fundamentals back in July, the principles of the advice process say that advice doesn't have to be followed, but it does have to be listened to. Now, how do we know if advice has been listened to? And more than that, you know, how do we know if somebody else has felt heard? How do we feel heard? Because feeling heard is more than just about listening, right? Because you don't always know if you're being heard. How can you know if somebody else is listening? Listening is something that's going on under the bonnet for somebody else. So you can be looking at someone and it's like, I don't know, that's what I'm saying going in, and they're taking it on board, you know? So how do we help people be heard? 3 steps that I would suggest work really well. Listening actively, you know, and that means giving somebody your full attention when they're giving you advice. If they've sent you an email in response to a consultation, you know, read it properly in a calm moment where you can digest it. Or if they're giving you advice face to face, you know, put your phone away. Don't look at your Apple Watch, Daniel. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. You know, and make sure that they, you know, make eye contact, right? Do all the little things. Give them, you know, face your body towards them. All these little clues that we can give each other that we're engaged. It really helps people, particularly when there's disagreement. It can also be helpful to, I can hear somebody typing, it's like the irritating, please don't. You can also use it to reflect back what you've heard. You know, so you say, oh, okay, well, this is what I'm getting. Maybe you got it wrong. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe what they said was ambiguous. Language is an extremely ambiguous thing. You know, they might have meant something different. And then double check, say, you know, are you feeling heard? Have I heard you properly? Is there anything else that I haven't reflected back that's important? Is there anything else that you need to say? And for me, you know, if you want to get into all of this, then it's kind of compassionate communication, non-violent communication, stuff in there that can be really helpful in going more deeply into this experience of listening. 2 nice little quotes, just to end this point about being heard. There's a lovely chapter heading in the NVC book, don't just do something, sit there, which I thought was appropriate given our relationship with don't just sit there, do something. And also this lovely quote, when I was in the listening mode, I didn't say whether I agreed or disagreed with what I was hearing, nor did I comment or rebut. You remember when we were talking about the peer reviews last week? I was saying that one of the things that people valued in the peer review meeting was going through feedback which didn't necessarily make sense, but with the intent to agree. Listening with intent to agree. Listening to say, okay, when you finish talking, I'm going to leave this space in which I'm going to assume that what you're saying is right. You know, I'm going to set aside for a moment. There's a great concept in RHD, one of the open culture books in Reinventing Organizations, in their Bill of Rights. They say a great way to manage conflict is to temporarily set aside our own need to be right. It's a pretty fundamental need for us. And to be able to do that, to set aside and to allow someone else to be right for just a second, right, is a wonderful thing to do. And then the final concept I want to come to is leaning into discomfort. Right? This is sort of the advice that we want. If we say, do you think I should do this? Right? We want people to say, yeah, go ahead, fantastic. But actually the advice that we need is much more like this, much more challenging. Why are you doing this? Do we need it? Can we afford it? Will we use it? Is it worth it? Is it in purpose? Is it in values? Challenging questions, right? Particularly if it's a decision that really matters to somebody, like, you know, can we hire another person into our team because we're all feeling really stressed? Do we need it? Can we afford it? Right? It's not necessarily an easy question to ask. And for me, you know, it's worth saying, there's a little plug for Difficult Conversations, by the way. But the subtitle of Difficult Conversations is how to discuss what matters most. There's a reason for this. There's a reason for that discomfort. In fact, you know, what is that discomfort, right? It's some sort of collection of feelings, anger, fear, shame, whatever it might be. There are some things going on there Generally speaking, when we're having feelings, when we're having emotions, like that's a clue that something important is happening around us. We're reacting to it. It's a clue that there's a conversation that we really need to get into. It's a clue that there's something that matters for us to discuss. So that's why I think it's important to lean into that discomfort. In those kinds of uncomfortable conversations, it's easy for those toxins to rise, particularly blame and defensiveness. You know, it's a really good question to say, why are we doing this? And to mean it sincerely. But it's very easy to hear from that, your idea is stupid, or even worse than that, you're stupid. Right? These are things that we do as human beings. We hear this as this or this. So managing that conversation for me and trying to avoid toxins and working with the discomfort is really important to making sure that advice is given and heard when it matters most. And how do we do that? How do we lean into that discomfort? How do we work that stuff? This is a slide from 2 weeks ago, the check-in protocol. Right? Why is the check-in protocol useful? Where you go around and you say what you're feeling? Because there are always emotions in the room. Name them more clearly and think more clearly, right? So you acknowledge them and they move on and you understand your context or somebody else's context. You know, and generally just following the principles of communicating non-violently. So if somebody else is making a decision and you think it's wrong, right? Like say somebody, Dan and I had a thing about this earlier in the year. He did something and I was looking at it, you know, from my story, and I thought, this is against our values. You know, this feels like a morally wrong action to me. And I was really, really cross. You know, so it felt like it was important for me to communicate that. Well, there were two ways that I could have done that. I could have taken that anger and gone and shouted at him. You know, or alternatively, I could say, I'm angry about this. Huh? Yeah?
You could have grabbed the whip.
Thank you. Or I could say, you know, I'm angry about this because I feel that this is against our values and I feel it's important that we do it differently, and then actually have a conversation in which we can understand each other's story, right? And I could get more of a sense of why he was doing it, and then have my, you know, have the worries that I have the stuff that was causing me the anger, right? Have that allayed and spoken to. So communicating non-violently, you know, I've promised, and I will make good on this promise, that we will have a session on training staff, and there'll be more in there on this. But communicating non-violently makes it more likely that you'll be heard, you know, and more likely that you'll feel heard. So two closing thoughts. One is a question. George raised this question last week, he raised it again to me this week. I think it's an extremely important question that's worth us thinking about. Who's the right person to make a decision, right? Is it someone who's disconnected from the decision, or is it the person with the most skin in the game? Right? We can see that there are two different stories at work there, and you know that we've got to reconcile those and work out which is right. You know, other challenges here. Can you ever be impartial inside a system? Right? Everybody's part of GrantTree. Everyone has thoughts and feelings about GrantTree. So, can we ever be truly impartial? Can we ever be aware enough of our own biases? Even if we say, oh, I'm connected to this, I'm impartial to this. Maybe we have biases we're not aware of. I don't know what we do about this. I'm very interested to have this discussion, and for this discussion to start, you know, I think it's ongoing. Finally, I want to end on this note, getting it wrong. In Joy at Work by Dennis Backer, which is the book about AES, and then the organisation pioneered the advice process and gave it its terrible name, the advice process, because it isn't a process. It is a law or a principle or a rule. It's a way of working rather than just a process. He said that we got it wrong all the time. We got it wrong all the time, but did we make worse quality decisions than any other organisation that I've ever worked in? No. Right? So we are going to get it wrong. Why? Because we're human beings. Because it's unfamiliar, this process of choosing who I'm going to consult, making sure that I've consulted all the people that I need to. You know, even if you've been doing this for a year and say it's old hat, it's like how much of your life did you live before you worked at GrantTree, where you did things in other ways and you used to, you know, a boss make a decision. And finally, because of the kind of meta quality of this, right? Your advice on how I should get advice, your story about the consultation that I should run on the decision that I'm making, and my story about it. So, you know, how do we deal with that? We find the third story and we say, you know, you ran this consultation, I feel that's the sort of thing where I should have input, is it too late for me to have input? But given that we're going to get it wrong, you know, we have to apply these skills of the third story, the discomfort, the giving advice, the dealing with each other non-violently, so that we learn and get better. So, an interesting topic. Questions or comments? Lively debate? Silence or thought? Any of those are appropriate.
I've got a little comment. Firstly, these get, like, at least for me, these are better with every single presentation. I thought it was awesome. For me, it was spot on. And something that really resonated with me about getting it wrong, and there's something I'd like to share with you. For quite a time, I used to think that this actually slows me down, because as Amar pointed out to me once, wisely, I'm not a naturally teamwork-oriented person. I am a lone ranger, and I also have a bias for action. So I'd go and kind of do shit. Like, that's how I operate. And for quite a time, I used to think, right, okay, this makes sense, but then again, I'll try to find things that I can kind of quickly do on the side, so I progress with my work. And recently, like, I'm just really, really learning and embracing this stuff, and recently occurred to me with things like the tax credit disruption, that actually, if you open things up, the way you're thinking, even though it's early stage, it may be embarrassing, you're not quite sure what you're doing, but if the first thing you do is to announce, actually guys, I'm working on this, and I want help, I want input, because I don't know what I'm doing, it opens up all sorts of things that you wouldn't have even thought were accessible or available as resources within the company. So I'm learning. For me, it's a bit of a story, a bit of a revelation, and yeah, honestly, don't be afraid to get it wrong, because I have done at least once or twice majorly. So that's me.
Thank you. I'm aware that there's a lot in this one, there's a lot to take on, and it's a big topic. So, I'm away next Thursday, so it's very possible that a sensible thing to do next Thursday might be to have more of a recap session on this, more of a Q&A when people have digested this and want to bring their own thoughts and feelings, and that somebody else can share that. So just bring that out there, that's an option if people want to do that.
How well do you think we do with that in a hip chat sense and a virtual sense? And how?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Like, what is the best way for us to run this stuff? Okay, so let me just to understand what you're asking. Are you asking how well do we do on the giving and receiving advice through tools, or how well do we do on the kind of non-violent communication stuff?
Bit of both.
The non-violent communication stuff, I think it is much harder to get right through text than it is face-to-face, famously, right? That's why, like smileys were invented. It's because text is so you can hear it in whatever tone of voice you want to hear it. And it's nonsense to say that, 75% of communication is non-verbal. I don't know, have you ever seen a mime artist? Like, try and get a mime artist to explain to you the advice process. A lot of our communication is verbal, a lot of the information that we pass across is verbal. But there is a lot of non-verbal stuff that comes in there. Buffer, who obviously have no office, all of their team are distributed. In their induction process, which they call their boot camp, they spend quite a lot of time working with people on communication. Because they say, look, you're going to be on chat with your colleagues around the world, who you're not going to meet face to face until the next 5 monthly meetup. So if you've just been hired at the wrong point in the cycle, you're not going to have any, face-to-face contact with them for 5 months. So they're only going to know you virtually. So it's important to know how you come across in text. So they give each other a lot of feedback, which is, well, I don't know if you know, but you were coming across, in this way here. Or we generally try and avoid that kind of phrasing because we've learned that it can come across the wrong way. So getting good at this in text is difficult. The most important thing to remember is that none of us is ever perfect. None of us is ever the person who we want to be, but we're all on the way there. And actually having the intention and being on the journey is what matters. And I think there is a great deal of intention in the business to do it well. And there have obviously been decisions in the last couple of weeks that have been quite emotive. And I feel like each time one of these subjects comes up, we're handling it better than we have done before. If you look at where we are now on this versus where we were 2 months ago or 6 months ago. But is there still work to do? Yes, there is. Is text, email, or hip chat the hardest place to do it? Yes, it is.
How do you propose we tackle the challenge of who is the right person? Because I used to think that the right person is simply the person who feels they can take on this responsibility. But what happens if 2 or 3 people feel that they can actually take responsibility for, I don't know, for example, deciding on the Nikki, yours is the
Remote working.
remote pay. Yeah. So what if two people stepped up and said, actually, I want to take? What would happen then? Because I used to think that it's going to be, because it's such a responsibility to almost do any advice process, that naturally it's going to be limited to the one person who's the first to step up to actually say, okay, this is hard, but okay, I'm taking this on. But it is a valid question.
It's a very
so
important
how do
question.
you think we can begin to figure this out?
I don't know. I genuinely don't know, but I would like help to understand what the best way forward is. I think it's something that we need to work out together.
Are there any answers to enjoy at work?
Enjoy at work, they had a very light hierarchy. They had 3 tiers of hierarchy across the whole business. And one of the functions of people who were designated team leaders, they had a leader for every group of around 40 or 50 people, was to make sure that all the decisions that needed to be made in that team were being made, and to request people to make those decisions. So, the team leaders didn't have any more power. In some ways, they had less power. They were expected to make fewer decisions themselves, but they were there to do them. Leading with a servant's heart, straight out the Bible. Dan?
I almost managed to remain quiet in the class session, but
Yay!
I have a suggestion for this. If we've got several choices, it sounds like a decision needs to be made. I wonder what process we have to make decisions. So we could just run an advice process about who should take on that decision.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not a bad call, actually. Maybe we should try it once. Maybe we should try it once.
Somebody's going to step up and say, I feel comfortable to make that decision. If they're still discomfortable about that, then you run another advice process until you've got 15 advice processes piled on top of each other.
I mean, it might be legitimate
Well, that's
to
the
offer
problem, because then it does begin to slow you down.
I think
Sorry, but
yeah, at some point we would cut through that. We're not a computer program. We're not going to get stuck in some sort of infinite recursive loop. We will just intervene. I think it could be legitimate advice to offer to someone who was saying, "Oh, I'm making this decision. Can you give me advice?" To say, "Well, actually, my advice is, I think you're the wrong person to make this decision, and these are my reasons."
That's a really courageous thing to say, though.
It's uncomfortable, isn't it?
Yeah, but to be able to
But
give
if
that
you
level
believe
of
it.
honesty and feedback, yeah.
Do you see what I mean? If you genuinely believe that, that's one of those
No.
things where, finding a way to communicate that to somebody could be really important. But how we determine who the right person is ongoing, and I think that's something that we need to get good at. When there are, because it's easy for something like, where are we going to have a Christmas party? What are we going to spend on it? But when it's really kind of, emotive, powerful stuff that affects the whole business, then who's the right person to decide? Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody remote? How Ellen is saying?
I don't know if this is one for another recap session, but where are you going to talk about what's there's this concept of disagreeing, different worldviews and stuff. In the least profitable case, the case where we agree to disagree, how does that translate into the advice process? Kind of a legal question.
Okay. For me, we come back to saying, well, we come back to a couple of things, right? In fact, I tell you what, why don't I show? PowerPoint has encountered an error and has to close. Disappointing. Let's see if we can reopen it, shall we? For me, there are some things that we said around. Let's unwind the slide and see if it's helpful. Yeah, so we talked when we did the first session on the advice process about some of the rules. And there's one willing decision maker responsible for decisions, consequences, advice has to be listened to and maybe followed. Decisions have to be communicated and explained. If you disagree, seek clarification or offer advice, and decisions can be changed. What are the decisions? So, if you're making a decision and you ultimately have to come to a point where you agree to disagree, we come back to the fact that one person is the decision maker, and the fundamental principle, the way self-management works, the way the advice process works, is you have one decision maker, and everybody else is providing advice. And we assume that that decision maker is going to listen to that advice, hear that advice, weigh it up. We assume that that decision maker is going to be willing to find the third story, to assume that there may be 2% truth in the other worldview, to open out their own view, to see if they need to change their mind. And if you're doing all of these things and you still find that you disagree and you still say, well, actually, to me, it really seems like you know, having opened myself up to your worldview and having explored it genuinely and sincerely, that the thing that the business needs, the right decision for the business, because this is what we said is, you know, a good decision for the business, it still seems to me that a good decision from the business, or the best decision from my point of view, is to do it this way, the way that you disagree with. And then we come back to this thing about, you know, what would it be like if we were in a... It's lovely when you put animations on these slides, but then you have to stop. I've responded to rejection by listening it, by seeing if I can modify my plan. I've modified it to the extent I can. I've suggested some other things that we could do which will help, you know, like counteract your objections and the way that you think that this might negatively impact you or the business. Now, I'm seeking your buy-in. Because one of the things that we said earlier in the year is every decision is the decision of the business, right? That's a fundamental thing which, you know, any organisation has a right to ask, which is when a decision is made in the team, that the team gets behind that decision, and that we don't sow, you know, that we don't sow sort of dissent. We don't be like, well, I made a decision I don't agree with, so I'm just not going to help. You know, if you disagree, you have to have that conversation, and if it comes to a point in which it's like, well, I'm sorry, but this is the decision I'm going to make, you know, please will you support me on this, you know, because there's nowhere else we can go, we're in deadlock, then, you know, you have a choice, which is either you go with it, or you say, I'm afraid I can't agree with you, so I'm going to have to make another decision to reverse your decision. And as we said earlier in the year, if you're making a decision that explicitly changes a previous decision, you're expected to run a consultation at least equivalent to the one done before. So you have to go and talk to all the people who have spoken to before, hear their advice, and, you know, they may say exactly the same thing that they did to the other person who's making the decision that you disagree with, and when you've gone through that process and heard all that information firsthand, maybe you'll come to a point at which you're... But what would we do if we got to a point at which we had two people who were just like constantly reversing each other's decisions? I mean, we would just have to sit them down and say, right, this is tearing the business apart. What are you going to do here? You know, because you're going to have to find a way through this, because this is not a way for us to make money. You know.
Also, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I can't help feeling is that it may seem sometimes cumbersome and kind of limiting in a way that it takes time for things to happen. But I think it's just like a training wheel for us, and we'll get to a point where we're instinctively, intuitively, these things will happen really, really fast, and we'll be so much more efficient at companies that make decisions in a traditional way. Do you think that's true?
I also think we will make better decisions. You know, because this is a really strong decision-making process. Seeking advice, listening to it, responding to objections. You know, I think we will make good decisions. And I mean, there's enormous efficiency in self-management. There's enormous efficiency in, you know, as I was saying last week, you know, and like proceeding a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about non-violence as a concept and saying, look, this is stuff that allows us to be vulnerable with each other. And vulnerability is the thing that allows us to be creative and to innovate and to change things. If we want to change the world, if we want to dream big, if we want to make things happen, then we need to be able to have creative, collaborative, open dialogue with us. It's very fast and efficient dialogue. So you're not pussyfooting around. You know, you're not playing a political game. You're not wasting time. You're just like, those are your views, these are my views. Please go and make a decision. Okay. Right, brilliant. One final question before we go. I mean, if anybody could send me feedback on this, it would be great. Is lunchtime on a Thursday a good time to have this? George said that maybe lunchtime wasn't such a good time because people want to go and have lunch, or maybe having it at lunchtime makes it seem like it's somehow, you know, kind of a sideline where actually we think that maybe this is quite important to build this understanding of how you run the business. So drop me a line if this time doesn't work for you, if you think, when will be a good time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.